So what I want to do is think with you first about what do we mean by understanding? Why is teaching for understanding important? And then what do we mean by teaching for understanding? What does that include? And finally think about what are the role of ICTs and e-learning and supporting that. To get the conversation started about why understanding is important, I sometimes think of this progression with the arrows representing meaning. So meaningful data is information, meaningful information is knowledge, meaningful knowledge is understanding, and knowledge connected with values is wisdom. I think in the past, educational systems have focused too much on this lower left corner in transmitting information and maybe knowledge to students. But in a world where knowledge is changing so fast, we need to prepare students not to understand what's already known, but to negotiate in a world where much is unknown and much is changing. So I think our educational systems need to focus more on cultivating understanding and wisdom. But what do we mean by understanding? Let me ask you to think about something that you understand very well. So I'm asking you to reflect on your own experience and think of something that you're sure you understand and consider how you know you understand that. It could be something you learned in school, but it might be something that you know from some other part of your life. It might be that you know how to tell stories or dance the tango or have a dinner party. Maybe you know how to act in a play. Think of something you understand and then ask, how do you know you understand it? What's the evidence? I'll give you a minute to think. So sometimes if I have a lot of opportunity, I will ask people what they have in mind and how they know they understand it, but since our time is short, I will say that usually when I ask this question to people and they tell me how they know they understand it, they will say things like, especially if I'm talking to educators, I can teach this topic and my students understand it. So I know I understand it because I can help others understand it. Or I know I understand this because I can use what I understand very well in a range of circumstances. The point for me and for the people that I worked with on the Teaching for Understanding project is that understanding is not just about what you have stored in your mind. It's your ability to put it into practice flexibly and creatively in the world. So our shorthand way of expressing this idea is that understanding is a performance capability. It's not just a mental possession. But then the question to consider is, how did you develop this understanding? And here I'll stop again so you can think about your own experience. Go back to this, whatever it is that you understand well, and reflect on how did you come to understand it? What were the experiences that helped you develop this understanding? This is your opportunity to think. So again, just to condense the conversation, I'll imagine what was going on in your head based on what I've heard from other people. But what they say is, I developed this understanding by watching or listening, but then trying out my own skills. Maybe I got feedback and coaching from somebody who was already very knowledgeable. I see people nodding. The fundamental insight is that not only is understanding of performance, but it's developed through performance. So acting with your knowledge helps you develop and demonstrate your understanding. And that puts this notion of performance, understanding performances or performances of understanding in a central place as both a mechanism for developing understanding and as a way of demonstrating understanding. It's easier to think about this notion of understanding developed through performance, sometimes in relation to athletics or to the arts. Nobody would expect people to learn to play football simply by reading about it. Of course, you would have to, you might read, you might look at diagrams, you might listen to your coach explain how to do things, but then you would go out on the field and work on it. And you would be able to see from your own experience whether you made goals or missed the ball altogether. Your coach would say you need to carry your weight differently. I don't know anything about football, so I'm making that part up. But you would get feedback on your draft work. And the same is true if you were learning to play the cello. But in school, much of the reading or much of the learning that we do is not a similar kind of coaching of performance. It's a much more passive experience. So what does teaching for understanding need to look like if we believe that understanding is a performance capability? That was the question asked by a group of researchers and school teachers brought together at Harvard University under leadership from Howard Gardner and David Perkins in the 1990s. This Teaching for Understanding project started with the conception of understanding as a performance capability, and then went looking for teachers who were good at cultivating understanding on the part of their students in 8 or 10 different kinds of schools in the Boston area, both elementary and secondary schools. Teachers of different subject matters were nominated who were very good at cultivating their students' performance capability in terms of understanding. With those teachers, we wrote case studies of their work and analyzed themes in what we saw in those case studies, and the patterns that emerged and involved these elements. First, we saw that teachers who were effective at cultivating students' understanding built their curriculum around what we came to call generative topics. These were topics that were central to the subject matter they were teaching. They were core to the curriculum, but they also were framed in a way that was connected to learners' interests and to the teacher's passions. And they were framed in a way that allowed students to work with the idea using multiple media or entry points, as we called them, ways into the subject matter. And they were framed usually as a question or in some way that invited continuous inquiry. So they were topics that you didn't just cover, you uncovered them, and they revealed more depth. A second characteristic of teaching for understanding was that teachers focused on goals that aimed not just at remembering, not just in the lower part of that diagram of recalling information or knowledge, but aimed at cultivating students' ability to apply their knowledge creatively in the world. And those goals were made clear and explicit to learners from the beginning. So students were really aware of what the goals of their learning were. A third characteristic, not surprisingly, was that teachers who were effective at cultivating understanding designed lessons that included many opportunities for students to act with their knowledge, to apply what they were learning, to get feedback on early drafts and revise those to improve them. So there was a progression of performances over time that ramped students up from where they started in their understanding to a more sophisticated level of expertise. A fourth characteristic was that teachers who were good at cultivating understanding used what we now call formative feedback. We called it ongoing assessment and feedback, meaning that there were many opportunities to get to look at draft work in relation to criteria for high quality work, with the criteria clearly related to goals, made obvious and public to learners. So there were explicit criteria that learners themselves could use to review their early draft work they got feedback from their teacher about how to improve it, then they had an opportunity to revise and improve their work at least once and often multiple times. It's different from what often happens in schools. And finally, because criteria for high-quality work were made public and explicit to learners early, there was also a basis for students to give feedback to one another. And gradually we came to realize that the context within which Teaching for Understanding works best is one where all members of the learning community are participating in collaboration and reflection together about their work. This is one image of how Teaching for Understanding is different from typical work. Assessment more often looks like this. And there's no useful information about how you could do better, just that wasn't good. My husband gave me this image once, and I'm not too sure why he thought it was a good present. So how is Teaching for Understanding different from traditional instruction? One way to sum it up is with this little teach-learn reflection image. I think the traditional expectation is if you teach it, they learn it. And there's more focus on, I covered the curriculum than there is on what did people really understand. If you listen to the language of education about delivering instruction, what you begin to hear underlying the usual talk and assumptions is the idea that knowledge is a product to be distributed, that teaching is a matter of transmitting that product to the learners, that learning is basically a process of receiving information. The job of students is to absorb information and repeat it back pretty much in the form that it was transmitted to them. Exams test whether they can do that. And if you look at schools, the way the furniture is organized looks like this. They're set up for transmission, which is what I'm doing right now, except for a little occasional opportunity for you to think. But for the most part, schools are organized as places where teachers cover the curriculum. I think of this as a combination of assumptions and practices and settings that add up to a paradigm, a transmission paradigm. But Teaching for Understanding is really built on quite a different paradigm, in which understanding is thought of not as a product, but more as a process, where teaching is not a matter of transmitting, but of cultivating performance capability on the part of learners, where learning is an active process of constructing understanding, of making sense of ideas, not simply of taking them in, where the job of learners is to think, to apply what they're learning, to create, to critique, where exams need to be more performance assessments that assess expertise, not just whether you got the information in your head, and where members of learning communities actively participate in teaching and learning, all the members. So teachers are learners and students are teachers, as well as vice versa. And all these members share authority and responsibility for both teaching and learning. And where the nature of the school is a community of inquiry, where the adults as well as the learners are continually involved in reflecting on their progress and thinking about how they can improve. So it's a real different paradigm, this Teaching for Understanding construction paradigm or co-construction paradigm is quite different from the transmission paradigm. Teaching for Understanding is similar to many other current ideas in education. I don't want to suggest that this is a magic framework or that it's dramatically different from many other good ideas. I understand that my colleague Howard Gardner was here a month or so ago talking about his theory of multiple intelligences. I see that as very connected to Teaching for Understanding, not surprisingly, since Howard was one of the leaders of the Teaching for Understanding project, along with David Perkins. But this idea of multiple intelligences is that learners have many ways of making sense of the world and expressing their understanding through movement, through visual imagery, through sound, through philosophical questions, and that you're more likely to be successful in reaching students if you teach with materials that engage a variety of intelligences, not just the ones engaged by print. This notion is also reinforced by an initiative that it has a lot of currency in the United States called Universal Design for Learning. It was developed by people who study brain science and the implications for learning. It aims to articulate ways of teaching that make it possible for a wider range of students to succeed. It was started by people who work with students who have disabilities, and has evolved the notion that if you provide lots of ways of learning, fewer students will seem disabled. The metaphor is consistent with changes in architecture, in which in the United States now, and I think in Barcelona I've seen too, all the sidewalks have curb cuts, have little ramps that allow wheeled vehicles to reach the street and not have to go off the curb. The idea is that people on bicycles, people with baby carriages, people who have to use a rolling chair, all have the same access to the sidewalk now as people who are walking regularly. So the range of disabled people shrinks when you design things in a way that make them more accessible. So the universal design people's, their main theme is that you need to use multiple ways of engaging learners, multiple ways of allowing them to represent or make sense of ideas, multiple ways of expressing their understanding. Give them choices and variety, and more people will appear to be abled. And teaching for understanding is consistent with those ideas in the sense of recommending a rich variety of performances. This is an image that Terry Anderson, who speaks to you later, will recognize because it comes from his work based on John Dewey's work. Here the core message is that learning proceeds through cycles of inquiry, not just one transmission process. These cycles need to connect thinking, work inside your head, with action in the world. They involve some private work, but some work involved with other people, some public and social engagement. And that the role of reflection and dialogue are highlighted as important in connecting knowledge with action. Again, the teaching for understanding idea of focusing on performances over time with cycles of making sense is consistent with this image. One other thought is that with a focus on understanding as performance, there's an emphasis on making thinking visible to other learners, to the teacher. And by making thinking visible, the opportunities for students to learn from and with one another are amplified. This Visible Thinking website is organized through Project Zero. It's online, and it has a lot of really good recommendations for little moves you can make as a teacher that help make thinking visible. So I recommend that, but also want to emphasize that it's a line of thinking that's quite compatible with teaching for understanding. And finally, I want to reinforce that the culture within which a community supports understanding is one where authority and responsibility are shared. When we were working on the Teaching for Understanding project, the Harvard police put up a poster that appeared in our office, and it said this. It said, "Leaving the door unlocked is like giving everyone the key. And what they meant was, shut your office door when you leave, or somebody will come in and steal all your stuff. But what I thought was telling everyone in your class what your understanding goals are, making the criteria for high-quality work explicit up front, giving them multiple opportunities to define and achieve those criteria is like giving everyone the key to understanding instead of keeping all that information to yourself. So the point is that in teaching for understanding, the responsibilities for both teaching and learning are shared among all the members. So what do new technologies have to do with this, and how am I doing on time? Who's our timekeeper? Perfect. When you think about these characteristics of teaching for understanding, and then you imagine trying to do that with just the traditional tools of instruction of maybe a chalk or a marker in a board or worksheets or textbooks, it's quite limited. But if you imagine doing this work with multimedia technology, then you think about the possibilities of teaching in a networked environment, such as an online world. Lots of opportunities begin to appear. First, that particularly in a networked environment, the opportunity to connect schoolwork with learners' lives is vastly expanded. Everyone who studies with the Open University here does so from a context that is part of their regular life. So their connection with school is in the settings that are closer to home or closer to work. So the role of technologies in making learning accessible anytime and anywhere begin to melt the boundaries between learning and life. Digital technologies hold a lot of promise for creating opportunities for learners to interact with materials in ways that traditional print materials don't. They also enable students to interact with teachers and with one another. So the opportunities for making learning active with new technologies is, I think, quite obvious. Supporting multiple intelligence is much easier with multimedia, where you have visual and auditory, and we heard yesterday about virtual laboratories where students can work with simulated laboratories even if they aren't able to come to labs. Well, clearly maybe the lab would be an even more varied experience, but as we know, in many cases schools are not able to afford those resources. So providing at least simulated labs is a way of engaging a wider range of intelligences than reading. Also in an online environment that students can access when and as they wish, they often have the opportunity to take different pathways through the material or to interact with it at times and in sequences that suit their learning better than if they're sitting as you are, having to proceed through the material in whatever way I've chosen using whatever media I have selected. So the opportunity to allow students to pursue the principles of universal design of multiple pathways and multiple representations is higher. When students do their work in digital technologies, they can share them with one another. I found particularly in teaching online using electronic forums with threaded discussion tools that, unlike here, where I really have no idea what's going on in anybody's head but my own, I can't see through your eyes into your mind. But in a course that I'm teaching online where every student is going to post responses to the readings, I can see what they're thinking. They've made their thinking visible and they can see one another's ideas. This opportunity to learn from and with one another is really powerful. Also in an online environment, you sustain the opportunity for connections with learners over time instead of seeing them maybe once a week. In between those sessions, you have activities that allow people to go back to their lives, think about ideas, return to the forum or the place where they're posting their work, put up their current draft, get some feedback on it, and so on. So the opportunities to promote a practical inquiry cycle that is sustained and connected to regular life is heightened. Consequently, well, another feature of working with digital technologies is that when students produce products in that medium, the opportunity to revise them is much easier than if they've got a hard copy piece of paper. So both because their work is visible, they can get feedback from the teacher, from peers, from outside sources if you arrange that, and because it's easier to revise work, the basic principles of teaching for understanding are facilitated by digital technologies. The contact with other learners, the opportunity to interact with them across time and space is obvious. Overall, what I think is that ICTs and network technologies allow teachers to strike a better balance between how much guidance and authority they exercise and how much opportunity for inquiry and innovation and independence they allow their students. I don't think that discovery learning, where you just turn students loose to figure everything out on their own, is particularly wise. I think there is a role for teachers to provide guidance and support, but too often that's way emphasized over students' independent inquiry. To wrap up, I want to be sure I don't leave the impression that I think if you introduce ICTs or if you teach online, then you are automatically teaching for understanding. I'm not saying that I think the technology causes better teaching. I think it enables it, and only if the design of learning is enlightened in the ways that we've been discussing, will the potential of ICTs and new technologies really be used to support teaching and learning for understanding. But I think that potential is very rich. I know you all are already good at it, and I think that these ideas can form a basis for conversations among us about how to get even better at it. Yeah.